Hey everybody, thanks for joining Hero Action Fund's program today. My name is Sam Drismala and I'm a member of the Hero Action Fund team. I'm going to host today and serve as your guide to this conversation. Many of you know our fearless leader, Ady Barkan. He's going to let you know what's going on today, what we've got in store for you, and Ady, whenever you're ready to go, take it away please.
Hello everyone. The COVID-19 crisis has created a terrifying new reality, physical distancing and a global depression. Meanwhile, thousands of people are being hospitalized and dying every day. Suddenly, even for healthy and optimistic people, the prospect of needing urgent medical care is not a remote danger but an imminent threat. Getting our frontline healthcare workers like janitors and nurses and doctors the resources they need to protect themselves and treat sick people has become a tremendous challenge. Any treatments shown effective in treating COVID, from ventilators to drugs, are in short supply. And we must ensure that any vaccines that are developed are accessible to everyone, regardless of wealth or race or nationality. So we all need to do what we can to pitch in and help during this emergency. But not everyone wants to help. While we are all struggling to get through this crisis, as they have many times before, the giant, multinational pharmaceutical corporations are preparing to profit off of coronavirus. Right in front of our eyes. They are taking publicly funded research and trying to line their pockets instead of helping as many people as they can. So, how can we stop them? Our friends Senator Elizabeth Warren and Representative Jan Schakowsky have introduced a new bill, the COVID-19 Emergency Manufacturing Act of 2020, that would do a lot to help. It would enable the federal government to directly step in to manufacture surgical masks and other protective equipment, COVID testing supplies, and treatment medications. The bill also lays the groundwork and creates a plan for mass manufacturing of a vaccine, as soon as one becomes available. These supplies would be made available to federal, state, local, and tribal governments at no cost. The bill would break patent monopolies on COVID treatment drugs and ensure fair pricing for the public. We'll have Senator Warren on the show later to talk about her bill, but for now, we can take action to support her. Please take out your phone and text the word HERO to 50409 to sign our petition demanding that Congress pass the Emergency Manufacturing Act. Once again, that is HERO to the number 50409. Thank you for taking action. And thank you to all of our guests on the show today. Our intent is to both humanize and demystify what it will take to get everyone the medicine and protective equipment that we so desperately need. Now, I want to introduce you to a tremendous healthcare activist and leader, and a member of the Be a Hero team, Laura Packard, who will lead our next segment. Laura, the mic is yours.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. Let me start by showing you the video that we've been working on for a few months and starring some people you'll get to know in a little bit.
Our fight against an invisible enemy has turned life in America upside down.
At the end of the day, we're trying to protect our health systems from getting completely overrun.
So don't know if you saw it, Trump's HHS Secretary Alex Azar in front of Congress, being asked point blank, will a vaccine to the coronavirus be affordable for the American people?
Well, but we can't control that price because we need the private sector to invest.
Oh my God, when I heard that, I don't think everyone realized the gravity and significance of that moment. Here you have the head of HHS, but a former drug company executive fighting like heck to keep this system of putting profits over people in place, which is ridiculous in a time like this. I don't think people understand how this system really works and operates.
Here's the secret I'm going to let you in on that everyone in Washington already knows. The pharmaceutical industry can only create new drugs because the government pays for the initial research with our tax dollars. This is how they turn public money into private profits. The drug industry spends way more on marketing old drugs than developing new ones. And they spend obscene amounts of money to buy up smaller companies and then pay big salaries for their executives instead of funding their own research. Then they jack up drug prices on the rest of us. The result is that Americans pay nearly 4 times as much for prescription drugs than people in other countries. In some cases, 67 times more for the same prescription drug.
Even before coronavirus, we've had this massive crisis in drug pricing for all these Americans that can't afford these pharmaceuticals that they need to live. And when you hear their voices, you can just hear the frustration and despair that they'd be treated like this in the richest country on earth.
Begging for your life from for-profit companies is not a way to live. I have type 1 diabetes, and I've been living with it since 1996.
Type 1 diabetes since I was 12 years old.
The total came to almost $500 for one form of insulin that I was on. And I just remember I almost, I got choked up. I almost started crying right there at the pharmacy counter.
I've had sickle cell for 33 years, which is all of my life. The cost of the drugs throughout my life have been kind of just insurmountable.
When I was 26 years old, I was diagnosed with chronic myeloid leukemia. The diagnosis just upended my life. The therapy to treat it is $146,000 a year.
The Procrit shot that I take every 2 weeks is about $6,500 per shot.
This medication was developed on taxpayer-funded studies.
But drug companies are allowed to file patents on these drugs and then price gouge Americans out of being able to afford them.
With coronavirus, this is what you should be worried about.
So there is something that we can do about all of this right now. The Trump administration already has tools to bring drug prices down. It just isn't using them because it's cozying up to the drug industry. There's an existing law. It's called government patent use. It allows the federal government to buy drugs on the competitive market, essentially override or break the patent. If the company can't make enough or refuses to sell at a reasonable price, they have the option to do that. Donald Trump could order agencies to break monopolies around drugs at any time and stop price gouging. It would save people's lives.
Tell Donald Trump to end the monopolies on life-saving drugs. Let's start with coronavirus vaccine and treatments.
And now it's my pleasure to introduce Allison and DJ from Iowa and Florida, respectively. Hello.
Hey.
Good afternoon.
So Allison, want to tell us a little bit about your story and why you're working to hold Big Pharma accountable?
Yeah, certainly. So, as you saw in the video, I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when I was 12 years old. It was an overwhelming diagnosis. I had to learn this new normal of, insulin injections and blood glucose tests. But luckily, one of the things I didn't have to deal with at that time was the cost. I was thankfully oblivious as a kid, and even when I first got married. My insurance covered insulin pretty well at that time. But later on, I switched to a different insurance plan. And then in 2016, I visited the pharmacy to pick up my insulin. And it was almost $500 for just one of the two types of insulin that I was on. I had expected it to be expensive when I picked it up because I hadn't met my deductible yet. But when it came up as $500, like I got choked up and I almost started crying. And I knew I couldn't keep affording that. So for a few months after that, I was going to my doctor and asking for free samples. And eventually, finally, I was able to be put onto a different type of insulin that my insurance covered better, but the entire experience really opened my eyes. So I realized at that point that it was just crucial for patients to use their voices and to speak up. So I discovered the organization T1 International around that time, and I started volunteering for them. Later on, I actually joined the staff for T1 International, and I now work with patients across the country, and I hear these harrowing stories of people rationing their insulin. I've met families who have lost loved ones to rationing insulin. It's been an incredible experience, but a heart-wrenching one. And now with coronavirus, it exacerbates this already broken system. But it's also really tough for patients with diabetes because, one, a lot of people have now lost their employer-sponsored health coverage. So they're on the hook for the full list price of insulin because they don't have insurance at all. Also, excuse me, patients with type 1 diabetes are high risk for coronavirus, particularly when our blood sugars run high, which if people ration insulin, that's what happens. So yeah, it's just, this whole thing just underlines the need and demonstrates even more clearly that we need affordable medications and patients just can't wait.
Thanks. And DJ, why are you an activist on this issue?
Well, I'm an activist because I'm a sickle cell warrior. As stated in the video, I've had sickle cell for the past 33 years, which is all of my life. And with having sickle cell, it automatically makes me high risk for a coronavirus because people with sickle cell have a suppressed immune system, a weakened immune system. So there are a lot of different ways that we can be compromised by having a weakened immune system. The 6 feet rule that is incorporated now with the coronavirus has kind of always been around for us sickle cell warriors, because someone that has a normal cough or a cough or a sneeze, if we're close enough, then that bacteria could compromise our immune system even further and send us either into a sickle cell crisis, or we could have a virus or a bacteria or an infection that our bodies could no longer, fight off effectively.
And especially given that the drugs you rely on were funded with taxpayer dollars, right?
Yes, my symptoms include me having to have a kidney transplant back in 2011 because of sickle cell disease. And that transplant afforded me to have medicines that cost upward to, one of the medicines cost more than $900. And that's just to keep my immune system lowered so that my body doesn't fight off the foreign body or the foreign object in my body, which is my transplanted kidney. We also have drugs like EPO, a shot that I take every 2 weeks that costs $6,500 per shot. And without insurance, there will be no way for me to actually pay for that shot that's needed every 2 weeks, let alone the 3 or 4 medicines that I take because of my transplant. And those medicines that I take because of my transplant will have to be taken for the rest of my life in order to sustain the transplant that I have.
Okay, so I think we're starting to see how big of a challenge this problem is. Next up, Laura from the Hero Action team will speak with 2 health policy experts who can talk a little more about breaking up the pharmaceutical monopolies and how Senator Warren's bill fits into this fight. Dana Brown is the director of the Next System Project. Her research focuses on health care systems, the pharmaceutical sector, and economic transportation for health and well-being. She has a stellar background on human rights advocacy, specifically around access to medicines. And Amy Kopczynski is a professor of law at Yale Law School, one of the world's foremost authorities on international global health law. You saw her earlier in our video. So please take it away, Laura and team.
Why don't you start with explaining how we got here and then what can we do about it?
Sure. Thank you so much. And just first and foremost, I want to say thank you for having me today amongst all these incredible voices. As a patient, first and foremost, but also as a researcher and an advocate, it's really a pleasure to be around here and to feel the solidarity of all of us in this fight together, even as we are, many of us, alone in our homes. So thanks. I'll start the way that I pretty much always start, which is to say, America, we have a drug problem. We have a highly sophisticated, technologically advanced pharmaceutical sector that systematically and sometimes catastrophically fails to meet the needs of our society, our health, and our economy. What we're seeing right now in terms of COVID-19 profiteering and restricted access to medicines is illustrative of systemic problems with the industry, right? Our pharmaceutical industry is designed to do one thing above all else, and that's maximize profits. That's something it does exceptionally well. Big pharma companies are among the most profitable in the United States. And as it turns out, that drive to maximize profits, to always meet the needs of the shareholders first, that translates directly into a number of harmful outcomes for our society. And I'm not just referring to unconscionably high prices, but also to recurring shortages in essential medicines, declining innovation in areas critical to public health, and rising post-market safety issues. These are all the natural outcomes of an industry that is oriented singularly around the goal of maximizing profit. To get different outcomes, we need a different design. And that starts today, right? That starts with the public sector breaking the stranglehold that Big Pharma has on our medicine supply. Medicines and medical knowledge used to be widely treated as a form of public good, but over the years, we've allowed the sector to become highly privatized and financialized. In the name of efficiency, competing companies consolidated heavily, vertically integrated, and whittled their supply chains down so that we often have a single source for many drugs, making that supply chain really vulnerable to shocks. The system might work well for shareholders, but not so much for those of us who actually pay for much of it, the public, right? As you heard before, you, me, everyone else, we actually pay for the majority of the basic scientific research that underpins the entire industry. And then we're forced to pay again to access the medications we need. Roughly 75% of the most innovative drugs trace their origins to funding from the National Institutes of Health. And that's not even the only source of public funding for pharmaceutical research and development. But in this monopoly system we have, this huge public investment is inefficient. That's because pharmaceutical companies themselves spend less than a fifth of their revenue on R&D, about half what they do on marketing. And on top of it, many of these large companies routinely distribute more than 100% of profits to shareholders, rather than reinvesting it into the research and development that's so critical to public health. So essentially, the industry's managed to socialize all the risk and privatize the rewards. And that, it turns out, doesn't work so well for all of us, right? Ever increasing prices and recurring shortages in essential medicines put strain on individual patients, like all of us, but also on the healthcare system as a whole. Right now, in the midst of this global public health crisis that may forever change our society in profound ways, it's become clearer than ever that Big Pharma's profit maximizing model just hasn't produced significant industry investment in a number of areas critical to public health, like infectious diseases, which includes coronaviruses. As you'll hear probably from some of my other colleagues, there's been a large amount of public funding for coronavirus research over the last 20 years, but Big Pharma's business model led it to prioritize other more lucrative areas of research and development, leaving us in a race to catch up today. Vaccine development, for instance, just isn't the moneymaker that Big Pharma is looking for, right? Since vaccines prevent disease, they're not as profitable as a pill you might have to take every day for a chronic condition. So they keep losing out in this competitive landscape of companies vying to make the most profit in the shortest amount of time. We are now battling the challenges of our lifetime without the tests, the treatments, or the vaccines we need to keep our society safe. Yet we're funneling more and more of our public money into a system that's best placed to produce duplicative Me Too drugs that generate profit, but not the medications that are most critical to public health. This pandemic has taught us a brutal lesson, and it's time to reclaim our medicine system for the public good. The good news is, right, that the power is there to change this situation. We'll hear more from Senator Warren and others later about specific legislation that you can support and the actions that you can take to support it now. But I want to leave you with one overarching idea, and that is government, our elected officials at all levels, already have all the power they need to assure affordable access to safe and effective medications and a whole medicine supply for our system, for our society. And not only in times of crisis like this, but always. The public sector has the power to do everything from enacting price caps to breaking patents in the public interest, to building redundancy into the supply chain and creating good public sector jobs in the process, to nationalizing the whole industry and removing the profit motive altogether, right? My point is the public power is vast here. It just needs to be wielded for the public good. This means that our demands for change should be big, because they should be commensurate with the magnitude of the problem at hand and the real power that exists in the public sector to address these problems. When the public sector intervenes, as we need it to, it will begin to erode the capture of Big Pharma and open up more possibilities for the kind of change we seek. We're all here today to start making that change because our lives depend on it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dana. Amy, What would you like to add to that? And also, can you talk about some of the drugs that we're hearing more about right now, like remdesivir?
So Dana gave a great overview. And I guess I thought maybe I would start by saying something about how I got into the same issues that we're talking about today. I started working on access to medicines issues. I think it must have been 20 years ago now, a little more than 20 years ago now. And it was through the lens of the AIDS pandemic around the world. I started out, I was sort of just out of college at the time. I was working for an organization that was trying to get HIV medicines, which had really, we just knew they started to work, right? This changed a kind of death sentence to a manageable chronic illness. And we knew that the drugs were really only getting to people in the global north, right? And that they would save lives if they could get to the south where most of the epidemic was. And what we realized is that when I came into that, I think I thought the way most people think, well, God, these drugs are amazing. They save lives. They're expensive because they're complicated to make. So what are you going to do? I mean, this is high tech. This is science. It's expensive. But what we realized, and this was really what the Access to Medicines Mobilization, the HIV groups were going to realize, was that the drugs weren't expensive because they're expensive to make. They were expensive because they were patented, right? And that meant, because companies held the patent, that nobody else could sell them. And so the company that held the patent was the one that got to set the price. And so they'd set what the profit maximizing price was. It's a classic monopoly problem, right? And we see monopoly problems, they're not always through patents, but we see monopoly problems in lots of places, by the way, that we're seeing coronavirus shortages and issues like diagnostics, like PPE, same kind of issues, although we're going to be talking mostly about drugs today, crop up in these other areas, right? You give one company the power to set the price, especially in a circumstance where something's life-saving, right? Imagine the fire department coming to your door and being like, well, what are you willing to pay, right? I mean, that's what we're talking about. We've given companies, it's a matter of public policy, we've given companies the right to set the price the way they like because we give them monopolies. And so for HIV, for example, these drugs that cost $30,000 for a year's supply could be made for less than $100. Right? That's what we're talking about. And once activists figured that out, they said, great, so there's a solution. You can make these drugs available by just overriding the patents or making the drugs available, like let anybody make them. That's a simple public policy solution. It's the kind of policy solution that governments can do and have taken action to do in the context of HIV. Of course, the next question becomes, well, hey, aren't you going to kill the goose that laid the golden egg, right? If we do that, if we just make these drugs available for the cost of manufacturing them, then who's going to pay for the R&D? Well, there's another sort of light bulb moment when all this group of people working in HIV figured out, wait a second, a lot of these drugs were developed with public money. It's exactly what Dana's talking about, right? A lot of drugs are developed very substantially with public money. So the public ends up paying twice. You pay up front for the research and you pay at the back end through high prices, right? So that was the beginning of the conversation about how to solve the R&D problem, right? We all want new drugs and vaccines for coronavirus. We're desperate for them today and for all these other diseases. So we do need a system that prioritizes innovation and R&D, but it needs to be the right kind of system, right? Because the drugs can't work if people can't take them because they're too expensive. And so we need something that gives us both access and that gives us innovation. And we actually know how to build those systems, right? We know what we need to do. A lot of what we need, especially in moments of crisis like right now, who steps in to pay the price tag of R&D? It's the government. It's been that way. It's going to be that way. Why? For all kinds of reasons. Companies don't want to invest if their returns are uncertain. They don't want to invest, where they're not guaranteed to make a certain kind of profit. And here in a pandemic, everybody needs to act fast, right? So there's a huge coordinating role for government. So there's lots of government money that's flowing into COVID. There was huge government money into HIV. Many of the places you look, and Dana gave you some of the stats, the public has played a huge role. Now, we want to ensure that if we're going to give a role to the private sector, that they also get a little bit of a profit, right? So that's fine. A fair profit is not what we're seeing today. And if you ask a company what's a fair profit, they won't even engage in that conversation. Just one thing that's really frustrating about the current moment, right? So let me switch a little bit to talk about COVID then, because we're all, stuck at home because we don't have better governmental response, particularly from the administration, but also we need treatments, we need vaccines. So right now, one thing to know is that there is a lot of government investment into drugs and vaccines. The US, because this is Trump's decision, has decided not to play with other countries. There's a bunch of stuff being set up internationally that could speed up research and innovation. We should be pushing to try to get the US involved in that kind of stuff. But the US is spending its own money, putting a lot of money into research. And one of the things that it's not doing is addressing how any of the stuff that comes out of that is going to be priced at the end of the day. That's a major problem. And just to give you an example, one of the drugs, the only drug that is now actually been approved for use in coronavirus, not fully approved, but kind of experimentally approved, is remdesivir. Remdesivir is a drug that's gotten a lot of attention recently. I will add a really big cautionary note, which is we do not have the data yet. There was a press release. That is one of the big problems, and Dana flagged this, is that pharma makes a lot of money if people think their drugs work, and they don't always follow through to show the data that you want to use. We have a problem that with the existing system works, which is that data is often kept secret. And we'll get more data about this drug, and then we'll know whether and how useful it is. It seems like it's only moderately useful, and doesn't necessarily even have a benefit in terms of mortality, like do you die or not, which is obviously what you'd want. So I want to just say I'm using this as an example because it's what we got, but it may not be even effective. We just don't really know yet. There's some good signs, but we got to have the data. So with that big caveat in mind, so this is a drug that Gilead is a company that holds the key patents on this drug, right? The way that this drug was developed was a part of its portfolio for hepatitis C medicines. So it made a huge amount of money because one of those drugs hit pay dirt and became a big, big bestseller. Tens of billions of dollars that the company has made on its hepatitis C drugs. This drug didn't work the way they hoped it would. They put it on the shelf. So it came out then off the shelf. How did it come off the shelf? Well, it came off the shelf in the Ebola crisis. Who paid for it to come off the shelf? The government. So government pays for it to come off the shelf to do some preliminary testing. Does it work against Ebola? And it turns out that they don't actually think that it has much impact. It doesn't do what we want against Ebola. So, but because of those tests, it was kind of ready in the pipeline. We knew some things about it. And again, there was a bunch of government researchers involved in the question, does it work against coronavirus? So then, turns out that there was some reason to think it might. Who paid for the big clinical trials, right? You know the punchline here. The big clinical trial, the one that people are talking about that makes us hope that it might work, paid for by the US, right? Right now, nobody knows what the drug's going to be priced at. I mean, Gilead is a company that tends to price things. We've seen it come out with drugs that, cost $84,000 a year, $100,000 a year. We don't know what the price is going to be. But just this is a good example because, it's Gilead that has the power to set the price until we start using the leverage that the government has to say, hey, look, let's be reasonable here. We paid for a vast sum here for the public research that went into this. We need an affordable price. And the government has lots of tools, actually, to get that affordable price if they want it. Some of those could be done through legislation. That's the kind of thing you're going to hear from Senator Warren, where there's lots of good pieces of legislation out there that would let the government take a role in manufacturing. And again, we got to think about innovation down the road. So there'll be some kind of royalty paid to those companies that did make a contribution, show their contribution, and they'll get a royalty. But then we get to actually make the vaccine, and we get to make it a vaccine or the treatment. We get to make it available for the amount that it costs to make it, or even have the government cover that cost and make it available for free, right? Those are the kinds of solutions we should be talking about. What kind of system can we put into place right now that makes sure that everybody gets the vaccines and the treatments they need, ideally for free, right? And then we figure out how to pay for the R&D in a smart way, right? We don't just pay the firemen whatever the private fire company decides to charge you when they show up at your door when your house is burning down. That's an idiotic system, and there's no reason we should use it now. We don't have to.
Wow. Okay, so I just want to say how much I enjoyed that panel. Thank you so much, Amy and Dana and Laura. What a stacked panel. Okay, so directly following on that, I just want to mention that Senator Elizabeth Warren and Rep. Schakowsky have this bill that they've introduced that would directly address a lot of the problems that were just discussed, like pandemic profiteering. And you can sign on to support the Warren and Schakowsky bill by texting HERO to 50409. That's HERO to 50409. Okay, and next up we have our guest of honor, Senator Elizabeth Warren. She is famous for having a plan, so it's no surprise that she has a great plan for how to deal with this crisis in a way that's going to promote economic justice. Interviewing Senator Warren is Peter Mayberduk, the Director of Public Citizen. He's an intellectual property expert with a specialty in drug pricing, so he's the perfect person to conduct this interview. Please take it away, Senator Warren and Peter.
Thank you, Samuel. It's good to be here. I'm so glad to be with everyone. Peter, I'm looking forward to our conversation on this. what I really want to talk about today is how we step up efforts to combat COVID-19 in a way that is both effective and that is equitable all around this country and ultimately all around the world. I know that these are very hard times for people. Tens of thousands of people across this country have died. And that means tens of thousands of families are in mourning. And now we have over 1 million people who've been diagnosed. So the way I see it is to get past the COVID-19 crisis, we have to do multiple things. We've got to have testing ramped up and accurate and available. We've got to have contact tracing so that people who've been exposed can know about it and take appropriate steps. We need treatment and we need vaccines. These are the things that we need plans for, we need execution, we need resources put into it. But understand this, we can't do any of this if we don't actually have supplies. And so that's what I wanted to talk about today. It's another aspect of what goes on. Not nearly as sexy and cutting edge as talking about vaccines, but absolutely essential. If we don't have masks so that people can be safe when they're treating people or when they're out in public, we got a problem. If we don't have swabs, then you can't do the testing that's necessary. If we don't have reagents, then you can't make the test materials that you need, and so on through the supply chain. Now, we could use the Defense Production Act. The president could have used this months ago if he'd had a plan and he'd had a commitment to start making sure that we had all of the materials that we needed. Had that happened, this pandemic would still have been a serious issue, but the problem would have been of a very different magnitude. And we could have protected our frontline workers better. We could have been better prepared for this. But we are where we are today. Look, I believe the president still needs to use the Defense Production Act, and I'm pushing for a bill through Congress that actually forces him to do it. As we all know, the president has had the power to do this for decades, but Donald Trump, when hit with this crisis, has just simply used it too late and too little. But I want to use an alternative approach as well, and that is public manufacturing. Think of it this way. We already, as a government, get out there and contract on a regular basis with different manufacturers, largely in the defense industry is the place most people know about this. So we let out federal contracts that assures the manufacturer that they're going to have a market for it, and they agree to use their production lines to manufacture whatever it is that we've asked for. I've introduced a bill, as you rightly said, Samuel, with Jan Schakowsky, Congresswoman from Chicago, for a COVID-19 Emergency Manufacturing Act. And the basic idea behind it is exactly what it says. And that is, it permits the federal government to go out and just start letting the contracts, putting the contracts in place to manufacture the swabs, to manufacture the masks, to manufacture reagents, and to get ready now to manufacture treatment and to manufacture the vaccines, so that as soon as a vaccine is developed that is effective, we'll have a method of production all set up, all ready to go, so that we can ramp up production immediately and then distribute from there. And then the basic idea behind it is that whatever it is that comes from this goes for free to our federal public health, state public health, local public health, tribal public health, and it goes at cost to anyone else. The idea is to get these products manufactured and get them out there. So it's, to me, it is about two things. It is about effective government. It's about responding to this crisis in real time. And it's also about using government to make sure that we are making available what's needed for containing and treating COVID-19 and making it available across the country to everyone. So that's the basic idea. Why don't I stop there? And Peter, you and I can talk about whatever you want to talk about.
That's outstanding, Senator Warren. Thanks so much for being with us here today. You've given obviously a fabulous introduction to the bill. We're very excited about the bill here at Public Citizen. I suppose one question that that your introduction brings up is, so then so drug companies make drugs, 3M makes masks. Why can't we rely on private manufacturers to follow market incentives and produce for the pandemic? Why public production?
Well, look around. I mean, obviously, market incentives aren't working right now. And we've seen problems with market incentives before. With the number of drugs, I've worked with Public Citizen before, and I'm delighted to be doing it now. The number of drugs that are, for example, generic drugs that either have 0 or 1 manufacturers that are making it. That's not a functioning market. When I'm on the phone talking to nurses here in Massachusetts or people who work in grocery stores, and they're saying they just simply can't get the masks. When nurses tell me about how they can't get the swabs to be able to administer the test, then clearly we have a market failure. And we have an extraordinary circumstance here because of this pandemic, in that demand has, basically done like this, right? Demand has ramped up so far beyond the ability to produce. And so doing this with, competition on dollars, this isn't the way to get this done. We need the federal government to come in and actually manufacture this stuff and make it available through all of our public health departments, make it available to our hospitals. That's the job of the federal government, as I see it.
This call has already dealt quite a bit with the problem of pharmaceutical monopolies. Any new drugs that are produced by private pharmaceutical companies will initially be patented and monopolized and potentially sold at limited supply and a high cost as a result. What do you see the problem? How do you see the problem of monopolies in medicines? Is it worse during a pandemic? And does your legislation speak to the issue of patents at all?
So the answer is yes, it is worse in a pandemic because demand goes up sharply and people are desperate, and people will, in effect, pay any price in order to get what they need. We've seen this not just with innovation on vaccines. Come on, we've seen it right now with masks. Masks that cost 75 cents. In fact, the price gets bid up and bid up and bid up because the states are competing with each other and creates this market failure. But on the drugs themselves, think of it this way. What the bill that I have with Representative Schakowsky is all about is making sure that we complement the research that goes on in the drug labs elsewhere, whether it's private or federally funded research. This is about making sure that we have production capacity. And overall, the direction that we take on this is on things that are not on patent, like swabs and masks and generic drugs. Then the answer is we've got a market failure. The federal government comes in and it will produce and distribute. For things that are still on patent, then the federal government will pay so that the person who developed and owns the patent is compensated for the patent, but we use it in the public good and still manufacture it and make sure there's plenty of it out there. That stops price gouging. And it makes sure that whatever drug or vaccine is developed is available, and available not just to the richest people, but available to everyone.
We're very excited about that feature of the bill, about the licensing of patents, among other things. We're hopeful that it actually can be a tool for accelerating the science and technology, because it means that other manufacturers will be able to build on that technology and produce better vaccines, produce better treatments, and rush them to market. So clearing these sort of these commercial secrecy barriers and fragmentation is really helpful. You have a talk this week with the director of the National Institutes of Health, Francis Collins. You've got a letter in regarding the functioning of BARDA, which is a federal agency that contracts with big drug corporations, giving them taxpayer dollars to make vaccines. And President Trump has announced something he calls Operation Warp Speed to facilitate vaccine manufacture. And predictably, it's not entirely clear what he has in mind. How would you say that your approach, or how would you direct the country differently than President Trump right now on this?
Well, you rightly point out, Peter, that we don't have many details on Operation Warp Speed. It's not clear if there is a plan here or not. And we know we've chased before when we thought there was going to be one, but it didn't occur. But the part that seems to me to be a big difference between them is Operation Warp Speed says nothing about once these vaccines are developed or treatments are developed, how they're going to be priced. And I think when we're talking about investing public dollars and investing public muscle, we have to think not just about getting the product developed, but how the product will be distributed to the rest of the country. And if the drug manufacturers are the ones who are allowed just to set whatever price they want and charge whatever they want, then I think we're pretty clear about what that means. The current inequalities in our system are just going to be exacerbated. So what we've done, Congresswoman Schakowsky and I, is we've said, as I mentioned earlier, that whatever comes from our bill is going to be made free to federal, state, local, and tribal health systems and at cost to hospitals, private providers. The point here is not for the federal government to try to make a profit off this. The point is to get this manufactured and protect public health. And I think that is the biggest difference between where at least the early description of Project Warp Speed is and what it is we're trying to do. We have to think about the implications of what a vaccine, but a vaccine at a very high price means. And we need to think about it now, not a year after that vaccine has been made available to some people and left so many others behind.
So with your legislation, the rich won't simply be able to buy their way to the front of the line in the United States. And hopefully we're also getting to a point where, well, in addition to price, we're very concerned about limited supply, right? So let's say that a year or two from now, there's finally is a vaccine working in a lab somewhere. How will passing your legislation now make a difference, make the key difference in that moment? Let's say there is a vaccine finally developed, but we have to deal with this issue of supply.
So that's what we need to do now. You know, this is, in a sense, this has been the problem all along with the Trump administration's response. We knew in January, scientists were telling us, epidemiologists were telling us about COVID-19, about the threats that it posed, and about how we needed to be out there right then planning for it. And that meant back then, we should have been stockpiling masks, we should have been increasing production facilities, and so on. Trump administration failed to do that, and we have seen the terrible consequences of that. All right, look at it this way. We know that we're working on a vaccine. And when that vaccine comes, we need to get that vaccine to 330 million Americans. And we're going to need to do so as quickly as possible and as cheaply as possible. So that means start now. Start building the plan now, building or contracting for the production facilities, and have a distribution plan in place. I picked public health, federal public health, state public health, tribal public health, because I think these are good channels for making sure that the vaccine is distributed. And then making it, as I said, available at cost to others. But that's the idea. Build it now and have a plan in place that will maximize the number of people who get it, and it will minimize the cost of getting it done. Every day that goes by, it gets harder to get every piece of this done. Throughout this pandemic, we have always been way, way behind, and it has cost us lives. It has cost us economic security. We at least have a chance with the upcoming vaccines. We can do better than that, but we've got to start now. And that's what Jan Schakowsky's bill and mine is all about.
I strongly agree. And what about developing countries? If access to treatments and vaccines is rationed or hoarded by wealthy countries, the effects could be devastating for people living on the edge, for modest gains that have been made in countries around the world over the past 20 to 30 years. Could be a tremendous setback. So how do we get beyond the 330 million? How do we prevent a global vaccine apartheid?
That's a great question, Peter. And the answer, of course, starts with just that basic truth, scientific truth, that none of us are safe so long as this virus is spreading anywhere in the world. And that's the reminder for every part of this. You know, when I was talking about distribution, even here in the United States, it's the reminder that we're all in this together. And that's true as a nation, it's true as a world. So what's the first thing we should do? We should be funding World Health Organization. Donald Trump's decision to block our funding for WHO is not only ugly and cruel, it's also just plain dumb. If you want to protect just American citizens, let's assume that you have no heart about anyone else in the world and feel no kinship to other human beings, you'd still want to fund WHO. You'd still want worldwide health security. And the way we do that is through these international agencies. And there is no doubt, and I think you're right to raise it now, Peter, that one of the things we have to think about is when we develop this vaccine or we develop treatment, we have to be willing to make it available, not just to people here in the United States. We have to be making it available to everyone around the world. And again, can I underline the importance of planning? We should be talking about that now, about other production facilities around the world and our willingness with whatever we develop to share it so that the rest of the world can also have access to the vaccines or have access to the treatment. Think of it this way. If treatment is developed somewhere else, we sure want to be able to get access to it in the United States. We have to be willing to work with others around the world to make that happen. And we need to plan now. Make your voice heard on this. We're putting together the next coronavirus response package. And Jan Schakowsky and I are trying to get this into the package. So we think this is a great public health initiative. We think it ought to have bipartisan sponsorship. We're going to keep pushing on this, but we just need more people to say this is important. So you'll get a number for texting, petition. Yes, it matters. Also, call your senators, call your representative, and let me remind you, that's true whether you have Democrats or Republicans, because it's important that they hear this and they hear that people want a plan, that they support a plan, and there's a plan in place. And that's our Emergency Production Act. You know, it's at a time of crisis that we take the measure of who we are as human beings. And are we a people who profit from the suffering of others, or are we a people who say we are all going to work together to get through this together, all of us, and that we leave no one behind? We don't leave people behind because of their race or because of their economic status or because of their health status. We pull everyone together because that's who we are. We value human life, and we're going to do our best to strengthen each other and to make sure that we do have sensible plans in place to protect not just the richest among us, but to protect everyone. That's why I'm in this fight, and that's why I'm honored to be in this fight with you.
Is there any message you'd like to send to the healthcare heroes who are out there putting their lives on the line each day to keep all of us safe?
Yes, I have two words, and the two words are thank you. In fact, I will repeat them and repeat them. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Look, I see this as a moment when you have indicated by your actions your willingness to put your own safety and sometimes the safety of your families at risk in order to keep the rest of us safe, in order to keep the rest of us healthy, in order to try to protect us all. And if you're willing to do that, then it is the responsibility of everyone else to make sure that you've got everything possible to be able to do your job and to be able to do your job safely. So that means all of your protective gear, all of the masks and face shields and gowns that you need, but also to be able to carry out your job. And that means all of the supplies that you need, the swabs and all the pieces, and that we are all contributing to getting a vaccine, to getting a treatment, and to making sure that it will truly be available and help get us past this pandemic. So we're deeply grateful. And I think thank yous are really important, but the best way we can thank you is to put plans in place to get us past this crisis and to make sure that you are safe and able to do your jobs. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator Warren. That was truly inspiring, an amazing leadership that we're seeing from you, and we're really excited to have you on the program, so thank you again. Everyone who's watching, remember, you can sign on to support the Warren-Schakowsky bill by texting HERO to 50409. All right, now I'm going to pitch it back over to Laura, who will introduce two more Americans with stories that need to be heard.
So you all will have seen Stephen and Laura share their stories at the very top of our broadcast. But Stephen is in California and Laura is in the Washington, D.C. area. And I would like to hear from both of you why you started activism, fighting Big Pharma, and what gives you hope right now, even in this time of pandemic. So Stephen, let's start with you.
All right. Hi, everybody. It's nice to meet all of you. This has been one of the most incredible Zooms I've been through all COVID. My story is pretty simple. I went to go get a recommended blood test at the local LGBT center out here, and they called back with horrible news. They told me that I had cancer, it's chronic myeloid leukemia, and that I have to get to the hospital right away. I incurred a lot of debt going to the hospital, about $40,000 for each trip. And then I got this. This is worth $146,000 a year. I can't put $146,000 in here. And this medicine was developed on public money, and it's gone up increasingly every decade it's been out. It's been out for about 30 years, and it goes up sometimes twice a year. They've done the pay-for-play mechanisms to increase the prices and keep generics off, and it has completely stripped me of any ability to be in control of my life financially. I have to take this. It causes a lot of pain. Like, I don't love taking this medicine. It makes me feel more sick than when I don't take it, but it keeps me alive, but at the cost of $134,000. So when we talk about the areas of people on the margins that they're okay with sacrificing, like, I would be in that category. Like, I would be in that part that can't afford $134,000 a year to get this medicine unless I had my Medi-Cal. That's the only way I knew how to get this, was to stop making money so that I can get on Medi-Cal, and that pays 100% of my medications.
Thanks. There are things that we can do right now to hold Big Pharma accountable, right? So that the people that are facing COVID right now, so that they will not be put in these traps.
Right. Yeah, I got involved in this type of activism because I just can't sit down and take this kind of abuse, which it is. And I started showing up to local town halls, and then that made me find other organizations. That's how I found Laura on the internet. I was actually a huge Twitter fan of Laura's for so long, and then I got to meet her in Baltimore. And then it's just really started, it's really about starting to build connection and solidarity between your sufferings, whether you have cancer or if you are on an insulin prescription, or if you have a problem like multiple sclerosis. Like, we need to have a patient solidarity movement where we are telling our stories that are so powerful. And I've seen my story come to effectuate laws in the state of California. I know if you just stand up and fight back, you tell how abusive the story is, the grim realities that you face on a daily basis, like having to count bread slices. When you have to tell that to your assembly member, and you tell them that this is worth $134,000 a year, that really puts them in a spot where they know that they have to start to take action against something. And then when you do it in solidarity with others, you have other people come into the movement with you, they will fight back in a much larger numbers. And believe me, when you tell a congressperson that you will occupy their phone calls all day long unless some resolution on, you get things done. And that's how I found this movement.
Thanks. And Laura, how did you get involved?
So my name's Laura. Thank you for the introduction, Sam and Laura. I am 38 years old and I live in Washington, D.C. And when I was 14 years old in 1996, I was diagnosed with type 1, which is insulin-dependent diabetes. So I used this insulin that I've used since my diagnosis now 24 years ago. And nothing has changed about it. Not the packaging, not the substance. I mean, I inject this into my body 24/7. So if anything had changed or gotten better, I'd be the first to know it. When I purchased my first vial, or my mother purchased my first vial of Humalog in 1996, it cost $25. After the economic crash in 2008, I was laid off. I lost my job and was unable to get insurance at the time. It was pre-Affordable Care Act. So I went to the pharmacy and asked how much this exact same vial, which I need about 30 of a year to survive, how much this cost, thinking it would be around $28, $30. And in 2012, she said this was $180. Now, since then, it's almost doubled again in price. The price of this goes up at an average of 15 to 20% every single year for the past 24. And I got into advocacy because it's really fighting for my life. It's almost my survival instincts kicking in. But I also realized that we as patients have to tell our stories, that there's no Superman who's going to come save us if we don't all band together and let the world know and let our leadership know that this is not okay, that it's not okay to take Americans' lives and allow for-profit companies to hold us hostage. My dependency on insulin has controlled every single decision I have ever made in my life. What career I went into, when I went to school, how long I went to school, etc. What jobs I take. And it's ridiculous that something that costs less than $5 to make, like most medicines, as you've heard throughout this costs less than $5 to make, and it's $300 and only going up. So one day I sat down and I calculated at the current rate of increase how much it would cost me in insulin to live to the age of 70. And the answer is $7 million for just me, just in insulin. That's not even any way to inject it. That's not even glucose testing, none of the other things I need to survive. So a few years ago, I told my story to a journalist for the Washington Post, and I was astonished actually that in doing that, I was able to, among many other patients' stories, to tell my story, to have it heard, and together we were able to start this national conversation. One thing that gives me hope is that, at least in the insulin space, and I am knocking on wood when I say this, the public outcry from patients has stopped the increases to an extent. 2 companies have promised to limit their increases. The third company hasn't raised them since 2017, when they were raising them consistently twice a year, every single year. So you can't shame pharma because they only care about money, but you can make enough people care, and you can, by telling your story and by us banding together with, you know, all the brilliant minds that I've seen speak today. You know, a coalition like this is exactly what we need to protect everyone from the fate that insulin dependent Americans have, which is we have no freedom. We are controlled by this little vial.
Thank you so much, Laura, for sharing your story, and thank you too to Stephen.
All right, thank you so much to Laura and Stephen for standing up and your willingness to tell your stories. It's exactly the reason why we need to be fighting this fight. Next up, we have a conversation between Dr. Abdul El Sayed and Tom Perriello on leadership during crisis. Abdul was a public health professor and medical doctor before he decided to run for office in Michigan. He is an amazing leader with a great depth of understanding on health policy. We're really excited to have him. And he's going to be speaking with Tom Perriello, who is the executive director of Open Society US, which supports efforts to advance equality, fairness, and justice with a focus on marginalized communities in the United States. Previously, he was CEO of the Center for American Progress Action, a co-founder of Avaz, and most importantly for this discussion, he was a member of Congress from Virginia who played an instrumental role in passing the Affordable Care Act. As a member of Congress who served during the Great Recession, he has a really strong perspective on what real leadership in crisis looks like, and I'm looking forward to hearing his perspective now.
Thank you so much for having us, and really excited to be joined by my good friend Tom Perriello. I'll say, you know, my experience in government is as a health commissioner, and the thing about public health is that you only miss it when you realize that it's gone. And we have made a habit in this country of cutting basic public collective action until we realize that it's gone. And here we are. And we had the best shot at handling COVID-19 was in preventing in the first place. And we fundamentally missed that boat. And so, you know, we're not out of the woods yet. And I think your point is a really good one, you know, that 10-month plan around saving the economy. But it also starts with making sure that we are handling the fact that COVID-19 is going to resurge because we've opened up too fast and because we don't have the testing and tracing capacity that we need to keep it from transmitting at scale. And here we are. And, you know, that speaks to just failed leadership at the very top of our federal government. And I want to ask you, right, what does the next administration need to be ready to do as soon as they hit the ground to be able to both tackle COVID-19 and prevent something like this from happening again, and then also set the stage for the kind of economic rebuilding that we're going to need in an economy that is not focused on funneling money up to the very top while cutting and stripping away labor, but one that is truly equitable and empowers people?
Look, I think if you go back to the similar crisis in 08, 09, there was one thing President Obama got incredibly right, and there's one thing that I think we got half wrong, maybe fully wrong. The right was he wanted the stimulus bill on his desk the day he was inaugurated. And we had less than 3 weeks to put that plan together, which at the time was unprecedented in terms of its scale and scope. And that was an understanding that we were within weeks of the country going off a cliff into a Great Depression. I think that's the scale, scope, speed, at least, of which the next president should act, wanting that on the desk on day one. I think what we fell short of was that plan that was on the desk being visionary enough to really fundamentally rebuild a new and better economy. And part of that was the pieces getting stripped out of the Senate. The climate provisions, which were really a prototype to the Green New Deal, got watered down, though they were still significant investments. And then Dodd-Frank came later, and I did not think was strong enough, et cetera. I think that was because that was the first act on day one. In this case, I think the vice president and his team have an opportunity to spend the next 7 months being ready for that day one. We've supported over the years a lot of scenario planning, and people keep joking we no longer need to scenario plan because the scenario is happening. We do need to keep looking at those scenarios, but the fact is we know what COVID has revealed about deep racial inequalities. So I think there's a real opportunity here to think about what it looks like to rebuild that economy in a very different and more inclusive way.
One of the things that you brought up rightly is just the dire racial disparity that we've seen in the impact of COVID-19, and a lot of this was built in a set of choices that we as a society have made, going all the way back to slavery, but then Jim Crow, and then white flight in the middle of the last century. My job was to rebuild a health department in Detroit that had been shut down when the city's finances were taken over by the state after decades of disinvestment in the city of Detroit. And that leaves Detroit fighting a pandemic now with functionally a health department that is 5 years old. And you think about the ways in which COVID-19 has shown us the truths in our society. And I often hear folks talking about wanting to go back to quote unquote normal. But even before COVID-19, right, normal wasn't so normal for a lot of folks. Normal wasn't normal for the 10% of people who got sick and didn't have health care to support them. It wasn't normal for the people who lost their gigs, realized that any job that they had a shot at didn't come with benefits or health care. For folks who are getting evicted at some of the fastest clip in American history. And so, what are the things that we need to be thinking about when we think about what normal ought to be, when we go to build that normal? How are you thinking about that right now?
Well, it's a really good point you make. I mean, in some ways, the historical analogy right now is that we need the 10-month plan is really the New Deal, which we have to remember didn't actually get the country out of a depression. It got it through a depression, right? It sort of kept people alive and functioning during that period. And then post-war, after World War II, you had the housing policies, the GI Bill, and everything that built the American middle class as we know it, but mainly for white people, right? And so when we think about what it means to try to have an equivalent for this moment, we see the racial wealth gap and disparities that were the results of structural decisions long after slavery, right? And so when we think about the idea that we don't need to just do as well as our great American predecessors, it's that we can do better. We can actually build an American dream that is more real than the myth that existed before and more inclusive. And I think that we need to put people to work and we need to give people purpose. That was one of the things I so appreciated in Senator Warren's remarks. People want purpose right now. They want to be saving neighbors. They want to be serving. People have a tremendous capacity for compassion. And so we can call people into a national program that looks at issues like the education and connectivity divides that are just crushing the educational prospects of Black and Brown communities today. States and localities are going to be facing massive budget shortfalls soon while we keep hundreds of thousands, millions of Americans in a criminal justice system, many of them senior citizens serving long terms from long ago. So when we think about how we revisit this moment, we can be rebuilding a more resilient America than we've had before, and a more inclusive one. And I think we also need to understand, and you've spoken to this, Abdul, here and previously as a candidate, we need to make America affordable again. You really did used to be able to raise a family on a single income, and now not even a single person has a single income, much less a household. And so we need to understand, we need to stop putting duct tape on the 20th century economy that no longer applies here in terms of our policies, whether that's healthcare, whether that's climate policy, whether that's childcare or others.
Yeah, I think it's a really, really astute point, and the point that you're making, that rather than adjust to the past, we need to build the future that we want to live in. I really appreciate your leadership in this time, Tom, and
look forward to hopefully connecting when we're not doing so behind multiple screens and a lot of wiring. But it's been a privilege to chat with you, and I'm going to turn it back over to Sam.
Okay, thank you so much to you both. And now we're going to have another conversation led by Abdul, this time with Zain Rivzi of Public Citizen, to talk about the international scale of the challenge we face with pharmaceutical companies. Take it away, Abdul and Zain.
All right, Zain, it's really good to chat with you again. We had the privilege of chatting on my podcast, America Dissected, about very similar issues. It turns out these are critically important issues, and Zain's been bringing the heat in terms of both our data and understanding of some of how the structural challenges in the way that we make decisions about how we provide the world basic medicines tend to exclude the poor and underserved, both in our country and abroad, but then also a real focus on what we can do about it. So Zain, it's a privilege to be able to chat with you again.
Thanks for having me both via Euro and Abdul.
So Zain, I want to get started. You've really thought a lot about the circumstance within which we have this ultimate transfer of wealth from the public to corporations by way of drug manufacturers. So we fund them at the front end to do basic research, and then they buy the patent rights for medications that we have to use, and then they sell it back to us on exorbitant prices. Can you speak to how this is playing out specifically in the context of COVID-19 and what the consequences could be?
I think it's critical to understand here, what is it that what do we need? And the answer is we need safe and effective treatments available everywhere as soon as possible. We need billions and billions and billions of doses, and we need a system that allows us to get there very quickly. But the system that we've put in place right now, the monopoly-based drug development model, what that promotes is actually secrecy. It promotes unchecked pricing. It promotes limited production capacity. And so what you're seeing right now is, the US governments all around the world pouring billions of dollars, literally billions of dollars, into companies to push them to produce, to research, and to develop these treatments and vaccines. And I think one thing that's really critical to understand in these funding decisions and in the global context is you often read, there's a race. There's a race to develop treatments, and China is developing treatments and the US is developing treatments. But we're not racing against each other. We're racing against a virus that is deadly and ravaging communities and upending the world. And so we have to think about how can we work together to pursue this common goal.
Toward that end, we saw just recently the FDA issued an emergency use authorization for a drug called remdesivir, and that drug is owned and manufactured by Gilead. And if you've been watching this space, you know that Gilead has a long history of mismanaging the way that it prices critical medications, whether it was Sovaldi to treat hepatitis C or Truvada for PrEP. Can you speak to how it is that we need to put pressure on Gilead to make sure that remdesivir, which is one of the only drugs that has any clinical trial evidence to support it, is made available for everybody?
A critical part of this is realizing that right now we award corporations monopolies, whether it's through patents or exclusive licensing, and that allows them to dictate who gets access and under what conditions, what prices.
What do you think, if there was one silver bullet, and I know silver bullet thinking is kind of a problem, but like one silver bullet to solve this problem, what would it be?
It's a tough question, but I think the real question is about, who is in our circle of we? Frankly, we are far too okay with letting millions of brown and black people die all over the world. And we've let that happen over and over again. We see with the HIV/AIDS crisis, there's literally millions of people who are dying, and pharmaceutical companies enforce their monopolies, and the rest of the world just kind of sat on. There was a small group of committed activists who fought back, and they were able to reduce the price of HIV/AIDS medicines drastically and expand access all over the world. And so I think if there is a silver bullet, it's about caring. It's about breaking the monopolies, and it's about care, and it's about seeing the rest of the billions of people in the world as equally as worthy as you are to access to the latest technologies, as access to the latest medicines and vaccines.
I appreciate that, and I think you're absolutely right. As we talked about with Tom just earlier, 60% of all deaths to COVID-19 in the United States have been in majority Black counties, and the only reason that we can't nail down that statistic and say that such a high proportion were Black folks is because we don't even care enough to collect that data systematically. And so this is about how we prioritize, who we prioritize, and why we prioritize them. And right now, what we're saying is that our public policy prioritizes the power of corporations to collect royalties ad infinitum more than it values the life of people in our societies who suffer and die from these diseases. Zane, thank you so much for your work, your leadership, and helping to clarify these really complex issues for us. And folks can follow your work at Public Citizen. And I'll turn it back to Sam.
Okay, thank you so much, Abdul and Zane. And again, another reminder to everyone out there, if you want to support Senator Warren's bill, you need to text HERO to 50409. Okay, thank you. So, now we know the scale of the problem, and we need a strategy to fix it. So to help with that, I want to introduce Alex Lawson. Alex is the Executive Director of Social Security Works. He coordinates a huge number of advocacy campaigns to protect the economic security of disadvantaged and at-risk populations. He'll tell us a little bit about an advocacy strategy to make sure that our government holds pharmaceutical corporations accountable. So take it away, Alex.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Sam and everybody. Insulin is a drug that is over 100 years old. The analogs, the newest versions, are over 30 years old, some 30, 40 years old. There's been no changes in them for those decades, and yet every single year, the price goes up in lockstep. 3 companies in lockstep are raising their prices. And when do they stop raising their prices? Where do they find the price? What they say, what the market will bear? What they're looking for is prices that are so high that some people die, so that everyone else is terrified enough so that they'll go bankrupt to afford the drugs that they or their family members need. That's the system that we allow to exist right now. Why do 26-year-olds die? Because they are rationing their insulin, this drug that costs pennies to manufacture, because we allow that to happen, because we allow these pharmaceutical corporations to buy politicians to protect their monopolies. And then what they do is they turn around and they charge us the highest drug prices in the world. I use insulin, but I want people to understand, I'm going to go to a couple other diseases and areas. It's not just insulin. It's all drugs. This is how the system works. So the question of how do we fight back, it's right there in those same politicians. We don't have the billions of dollars that the drug corporations have, but what we do have are the millions of Americans, the tens of millions of Americans who are fed up with these high drug prices, who understand that these pharmaceutical corporations are a racket and they're ripping off the American people. But I also want to talk about the future because it's so critical right now. We are in the midst of a pandemic, and the reason that we are so far behind is because we allowed these pharmaceutical corporations to run the show. We would be way ahead of where we are right now if the public, if our dollars were not just paying for the research and then we gave it away to these corporations, because then they guide what we pay attention to. And you know, it's never profitable preventing a pandemic. It's just a cost. That's not a market good. There's no way that the private sector can actually fill the need here. That's why we're behind. The public has put in over $700 million into developing vaccines and research around vaccines around the coronaviruses, but it was never prioritized because the private industry will never prioritize it. What we need to move to is a system that recognizes that we pay for these drugs. It's public resources in, and we need to ensure that these are public goods coming out, including public manufacturing, so that the private system can't create these artificial bottlenecks as well. Because what we're going to see if we leave these drug corporations in charge is when we do get a vaccine, because we will. You know why? Because scientists and people driven by public health are working day and night to get there. And that's who we want to empower. We want to empower them. We can't empower these private equity brokers that are the corporations to then take that vaccine and do to it what they do to insulin every day. And that would be to withhold access to the millions of people, to the billions of people who need this vaccine, so that we can eradicate COVID in the same way that we did with polio, in the same way that we did with smallpox, through global solidarity led by the public, by the people working together.
Okay, thank you so much, Alex. So now we know the problem, we know the solution, and we have our advocacy strategy. So we need to take action right now.
It may feel hopeless in this moment during this pandemic, but as you said, together we have the power. We can force change on Big Pharma. So go to heroaction.org now and join us. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, so now we know what's at stake for our country and for the world. We know the scale of the problem, and we have a strategy to take on the pharmaceutical companies and win. So what we need to do is take that first step to action. So we all need to text HERO, that's HERO, to 50409. That's the first step. And we hope to engage more from there, take this campaign to the next level and keep on elevating it. And I really want to thank everyone who joined this campaign. The entire team at Hero Action Fund wants to thank you, and please stay tuned because we plan on continuing this work and continuing to engage with you on video on these type of events. So please like, follow, subscribe, and keep up to date with us because we're going to keep on going on this. It's been a lot of fun for me and for the whole Hero Action team. I hope it's been fun for you. Thanks again. Bye.